Welcome, everyone, to what will hopefully be a brief DOA Podcast update on the Shadwick King retrial. Of course, I'm Jeff Ward, and this DOA stands for Decisions, Opinions, and Analysis. And given that I caught up on a few things today, I decided to head over to the Kane County Judicial Center, courtroom 319, and observe the King retrial proceedings for about 45 minutes. And as luck would have it, perhaps some good journalistic karma, I happened to appear at a critical juncture. How does that saying go? It's better to be lucky than smart. So as I arrived, Kathleen Zellner, the attorney for the defense, Mr. King, was direct examining Mr. Bloom, an expert of some medical variety, essentially on Kathleen's time of death. And the greater issue was lividity. I feel like I should do my, Eddie Murphy from Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood. Can you say lividity, boys and girls? Lividity is what happens when someone dies. It describes how the blood, how gravity starts pulling the blood to the lower reaches of the body because the heart isn't pumping anymore. And that was nearly the entire topic of that 45 minutes. Sue Sarkauskas of the Daily Herald and I talked afterward, and she said, "Do you think they'll get to closing arguments tomorrow?" I said, and tomorrow being Friday, July 1st, I said, I don't think they'll get to closing arguments until next week. But the first thing that struck me was the lack of preparedness on both sides. There was, insipid back and forths about simply numbering exhibits, what to let in, how many photographs were in an exhibit. And you kind of expect that bitchiness from high school sophomores. I would understand it a bit better if this was a jury trial, but it's not. It's a bench trial in front of a 40-some plus year prosecutor, Judge John Barsani. And this insane back and forth just makes both sides look like idiots. I mean, it's not loud. It's not like, Trump and AOC supporters. But come on, you're just playing to a judge who's not going to, fall for it. On a number of times on the most basic issues, Barsani had to get both sides to shut up, say, you know what, look, get on with this. I'll review it and we'll figure it out. The implication being you two clearly have no concept of what's truly important here. And I finally got the opportunity to see Kathleen Zellner, the attorney for Mr. King, do a direct examination. And I got to tell you, I was not at all impressed. Again, it's more important to be impressive in front of a jury, but kind of wandering questions, not knowing exactly where she was going, repeating herself, not asking the question correctly. I was kind of flabbergasted. And look, I understand the prosecutor, the main prosecutor, the first seat, Greg Sams, recently had COVID. But there was a point in his cross-examination of Mr. Bloom when I wanted to stand up in court and shout out, "Take a fucking cough drop," or at least take a few sips of water. If somebody talked to me like this, "Hey, Jeff, I want to ask you a question," I would want to smack him upside the head. Greg Sams, considering how he comes off in general as a crotchety old man from a Pixar movie, he ought to be thrilled this isn't happening in front of a jury. So while Ms. Zellner sounded like she had a few too many glasses of wine, I'm sure she didn't. Sam sounded like everybody's bad neighbor. And again, it's not that bad in a bench trial, but can't you make a minimal of effort to be professional, to move the proceedings along, to be respectful to the judge, to be respectful to the folks testifying? And then when Mr. Bloom was testifying, the judge and the court reporter, the court reporter would look at the judge, had to constantly caution Sams because he would not let Mr. Bloom finish. We've all been in that conversation, I don't know, maybe with our spouses who would most likely be a wife, although I better be careful, or at a party where someone just fires off the next question before you can answer the last one. Even Mr. Bloom finally said, you got to let me finish. And that's one place where Judge Barsani should have been a little more direct in telling Sams to back off and stop talking over each other, which makes it impossible for the court reporter to do her job. I got to tell you, the most frazzled person in that courtroom, or at least who appeared to be the most, was the court reporter who was trying to keep up with all this back and forth. But part of the problem is defense witness Bloom, defense expert, he testified in the first trial, just offered way too much testimony. He clearly had no concept of the Tao concept that less is more. Say no more than what you need to say, because if you say too much, it opens up the door to all sorts of issues. So this thing goes back and forth for the better part of 45 minutes. And what Sams is trying to do is he's trying to impeach Bloom's testimony. He clearly didn't read every Geneva police report taken at the various steps of the case, because that would have been a bit overwhelming. I get it. So Sams was basically trying to say, look, you didn't read all this? Wouldn't you change your opinion if you had read it? And not only was he trying to say that Bloom didn't have all the information, he was essentially trying to say, you know what, you didn't even write your own report. The defense wrote this report, you read it, and you simply agreed and signed your name to it. And Sams was actually making headway until he asked one of the dumbest questions I've ever heard any trial attorney ask. And I've sat in on quite a few trials over the past 16 journalistic years. And that question was, had you read these reports, wouldn't it have changed your opinion? And Bloom looked at him and goes, no, because there's nothing documented. And Sams perks up, stops coughing just long enough to say, nothing documented? You're actually reading their documented reports. And Mr. Bloom just slam dunks Sams. He goes, yeah, I read the reports, but that's just hearsay. That's just what other people are saying. I've been trained that we only deal in scientific evidence. And unless I can see photographs of the scene, unless I can see photographs every step of the way, I can't render an opinion on what a police officer who may not be trained in these things offers. And then Sams got even stupider. He goes, well, what do you mean? What do you mean, Dr. Bloom? Before we had all these photographic possibilities, you mean the fact that a police officer said this wouldn't count? Or put more simply, let's go back to the early 1800s before photography. Wouldn't you give a little more weight to police officer testimony? And Bloom, who'd been tentative, meandering, and offering too many words up to that point, just looked at him and said, you know what? Forensic evidence has come a long way since then. And no, unless I see photographs, I'm not going to offer an opinion. And half an hour of Sams trying to impeach this witness went down in flames. But here's why my timing was so good. And I'm not giving myself any credit. Like I said, it's better to be lucky than smart. Because when I walked in, I got to see the photographs on massive computer laptop screens from attorneys on both sides of the pictures taken when they found Kathleen King on the Union Pacific Railroad tracks. And I was absolutely flabbergasted because that was the smoking gun. And I'm not so sure the prosecution realizes they've got this smoking gun, because I've talked to a number of people who have, Sue Sarkauskas, who have been sitting in, a Daily Herald reporter, who've been sitting in that trial, and nobody can remember a time where the prosecution made this point. At first, I was like, oh, great, I have to see a dead person. And it really was very disturbing. That's only happened once in my life at Evanston, when somebody got hit by a truck coming out between two parked cars, and I tried to help them, and it was already too late. It's something I'll never forget. I can't get that picture out of my head, and I will never get the pictures of a deceased Kathleen King laying across those tracks out of my head either. But such are the vagaries of practicing investigative journalism. But the first thing I noted was her positioning was insane. unless she ran down those railroad tracks, which is already a questionable proposition considering her after-death blood alcohol content of 0.15, unless she ran down those tracks like the Tasmanian devil in the Bugs Bunny cartoons, there's no way any human being could end up in that position. It's a bit hard to describe it, but if we're looking at her body from her head to her toes, her legs were skewed way to her left hand, her torso was twisted completely to the right, and her head was leaning back over the rail, her neck perfectly on the rail, at an angle that isn't humanly possible. There's no way any human being could have fallen in that position. They absolutely had to be placed there. There is no other reasonable explanation for that. And then worse yet, as any longtime runner like myself understands, when we go out to go running, we want our running clothes. We carefully choose our running clothes, and we want them to hang on us perfectly. Because if you chafe, if it doesn't feel right, you're going to get, you might as well, you may even bleed from that possibility, and it's uncomfortable to say the least. My wife will attest how I erupt when, in winter, particularly when my running shirt isn't tucked into my shorts correctly. I rip it out, scream, and make sure it's just right. I can't stand it when my underwear slips down when I'm running. My socks have to be on just right. The shoes can't be tied too tight. I may be more particular than most runners given my kind of highly sensitive nature, but I'm not that far afield. But when you look at Kathleen King's body, her running shorts are taut and pulled to the left, which would be incredibly uncomfortable. Her running shirt was, just like her torso, pulled to the right, and it exposed a great deal of her running broad right breast. And let me tell you, no woman runs that way. I mean, I wanted to stand up and shake my clothes out in the court, which would not have gone well with me because I was so uncomfortable looking at those pictures. Add the fact that in the first trial, the defense, the prosecution noted that one of her socks was put on upside down, meaning that the heel was on top and the top of the sock was on the bottom. There is absolutely no way any runner would make that mistake. First, it would be difficult to pull the sock on. Second, it would be incredibly uncomfortable to run. And third, most running socks kind of have a grayish tinted colored cloth to denote where the heel ought to be. So there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that Shadwick King killed his wife. He dressed her as if she was going running and deposited her body on the Geneva Railroad tracks east of the river without any concern for what her position, how she was positioned would look. He clearly assumed that a metro train would come by, they wouldn't see her, it would run over the body, and it wouldn't matter. No human being falls like that. No human being dresses themselves like that, particularly a diehard runner like Miss King was. And I do not begin to understand why this isn't the core of the prosecution's argument. They want to get into all this minutia. They want to, outdo the other one when there's two smoking guns. One, nobody runs with a blood alcohol content of 0.15 the next morning. And nobody dresses themselves like that to go running, and nobody falls that way. Along these very same lines, I spoke with a retired judge today because I was kind of, I can understand reasonable doubt with a jury trial and where there's far more than circumstantial evidence. So I wanted to know, how does a judge decide in a case, bench trial, where we only have circumstantial evidence? And the former judge couldn't really give me an answer because there is no answer. Every case is different. All the circumstances are unique. But what he did do very well was describe the process. And he says, you listen to the evidence and it gets to a certain point where you go, yep, that's it. The prosecution proved their case. we could almost end it here, but I have to let the trial continue. I have to let it resolve itself. So I got to tell you, if I was Judge John Barsani and I saw those photographs of the newly deceased Kathleen King laying across the railroad tracks in that position, that totally untenable position, with her clothes totally askew, that would be it for me. I would have no issue in finding him guilty. And remember, you're talking to a guy who's been a defendant. You're talking to someone who was the subject of the Unabomber investigation for 20 years. I am a defendant's defendant, but in this case, there is no doubt in my mind that Shadwick King is guilty, and I guarantee you that, I better not guarantee, I've been wrong before, but I would put 10-1 odds that John Barsani is going to see it the same way I see it. I suppose I should call him Judge John Barsani, but we were friends long before he was a judge. So that's it, dear listeners. I wanted to catch you up before the 4th of July holiday weekend. I want to thank my publisher, Paul Stukel, for being willing to turn around this brief podcast editing-wise in a short time. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for being so interested in the Shadwick King updates. I think there's going to be much more to this trial. We'll see if I can't see myself attending anymore, but I may make it there for the closing arguments. But until then, this has been Jeff Ward. This is the DOA Podcast, Decisions, Opinions, and Analysis. You can find most of these things, most of my columns on thefirstword.net. Thank you so much for listening, and I promise you we will continue the conversation.